Hi and welcome back to the Girl Gone London channel. If you're new here, my name is Kaylin. I'm a dual UK and American citizen, and today we're diving into UK versus USA date formats. And I don't mean like dinner and a movie, I mean the way we actually write a calendar date. If you're unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, the basics are that the US writes their dates by month, day, and year. So January 16th, 2024 would be 01 or 1/16/2024. The UK and most of the rest of the world writes their dates by day, month, year. So January 16th, 2024 would be 16/1/2024. This can be exceptionally confusing because while some dates don't make sense going both ways. For instance, there's no 16th month, so a Brit might read the American date format and be able to figure out that it's swapped. But if you're talking about like December 3rd, in the American format, it would be 12/03/2024. But if you read that in the UK date format, that becomes a real date, March 12th of 2024. There are a couple of other countries who use the US style format as an additional format, but from my research, the US is really one of the only countries in the entire world to use this as our like first and foremost ride or die consistent date formatting, which has seemed to anger the rest of the world who are constantly writing articles complaining about this difference, like this one in an Australian newspaper who say, "Wrong, wrong, wrong. We have all encountered the stupid way Americans write their dates, putting the months first," or this article in The Guardian, a UK paper, where the writer states, "Let's face it, it's weird. Basic group behavior shows it's weird." Now, I have to warn you that there is no better way to get an American to keep doing what they're doing than to criticize them for being different to everyone else, because to us, that just means we're doing the right thing. But I was determined to get to the bottom of this argument. Do Americans write the date differently because they're trying to be individualistic and annoying to everyone else on the planet, or is there something deeper there? I genuinely didn't know. Are there reasons for this that actually make sense? Let's find out. So before we talk about the abbreviated date format or kind of modern day date formatting, let's go back to the history of date formatting in both countries. I love how I say this with like such a smile, as if this is the most interesting thing you are going to hear all day. So I did hope that this would be like a clear cut and dry video, could be done in a couple minutes. It turns out that's not the case. So the UK and the US both have variations when it comes to how the dates were said or written out in the past. In the UK, we can see some examples of the date being written month, day, year in some very important documents like Winston Churchill's resignation letter in 1955 that is dated April 6th, 1955, or in an article in the Daily Mirror from the sinking of the Titanic in 1912, they write the date as April 16th, 1912. In fact, some newspapers in the UK still write out the date in this format, while others use the month, day, year format. But of course, these are just a couple of examples. We can find things that prove the opposite. For example, if we go all the way back to the gunpowder plot in the remember the 5th of November line, we can even go back to Winston Churchill and find letters to contrast his resignation letter, as these are marked with the date first, then the month, and then the year. Even within the same time frame, World War I, we can see in letters from UK citizens to servicemen abroad that some use month, day, year, like in this letter from a schoolboy that writes out September 3rd, 1916, while others, like this letter from a woman to her fiance, uses the format 28/3/17, meaning March 3rd, 1917. There are some assertions online that the UK actually used the month, day, year format during the colonial times in the US, and actually the US took the date formatting from here and kept it, while the UK over time changed it. You can see a few examples possibly of this. For instance, a letter from George III's most prolific spy writes the date as February 7th, 1783, but there are plenty of other examples of the date being written the other way around this time. For instance, this letter written by George III himself that's dated 22nd of November, 1785. So when it comes to the UK, with the lack of a definitive answer from any reliable source I could find, I think the best conclusion we can come to on date writing history is that people in the UK have in the past written the date out in both formats, but we can't say it was ever exclusively day, month, year before being abbreviated, or necessarily that way when it was colonial times in the US. Now, in the US, it is harder to find many examples of this dual date formatting. Much of what I could find does have the date being written out in the same format as it is in America today. Examples are this letter from George Washington, dated June 27th, 1779. The Declaration of Independence is dated July 4th, 1776. But funnily enough, this is one of the only dates in the US where Americans often will use the date before the month, as we often call it the 4th of July. If we keep going forward in time though, here's a letter from Woodrow Wilson, dated June 3rd, 1876. It keeps going on like this for American date formatting up to the present day, and I will share my research method with you because I didn't just search out things that fit any sort of hypothesis. What I did was I just looked up letters and newspaper articles relating to different points in each country's history and saw the way the dates were written. So I didn't just look up American letters or documents that followed what I was looking for. I truly did just look up time periods in both countries to see how people were dating things. Now, one thing I find interesting has to do with the Titanic, a British operated and registered ship, but American financed. A ticket for the Titanic had the date in the day, month, year format, but the menu was the opposite. Is this just random or an example of competing UK and US influences? I honestly don't know, so we'll have to keep wondering. Now let's move on to modern day date abbreviations, because the problem and why the rest of the world has America in its bad books for the way we write the date has less to do with how we might write it out in full and more to do with how we abbreviate it. In all of the examples from both countries we've gone through, you still know what day and month are being talked about because they're clearly written. February 7th or 7th of February, it's not confusing, it's just a different way of writing it. But the problems begin to start around the age of the computer era when dates are becoming abbreviated more often, and so a more consistent standard of date writing emerged. In computer science, the order in which numerical values are arranged is apparently called endianness. The UK style format is called little endian. It goes from smallest to largest. The US format is middle endian. It starts with the middle, then goes smaller, then goes to the biggest at the end, making less logical sense in the eyes of people who use computers and the international community at large. So much of the world has adopted this little endian format of date abbreviation, while the US stuck with the middle endian format in abbreviations. But why? The closest answer I can find is that when the date abbreviations became standardized in a digital era, the US just followed the way that we would typically write or speak a date. We would say January 12th rather than the 12th of January. So our written date formats match our pattern of speech and language and the way American citizens have been cognitively taught to think about and process dates. Could America have changed to match the standards of the rest of the world? Probably. And we did in some ways. Dates on our passports and official travel documents, for instance, match the international standard, and you'll find that this is used throughout the military and some academia and other areas where the US is interacting with the rest of the world on an international level. But for the most part, the Americans sort of stuck with what was already used and commonplace in the country. One argument for the American version is that while the American version may make less sense when it comes to ordering information from a computer or data entry perspective, putting the month first might align better to how humans take in information. For instance, our paper calendars are organized where you turn to the month first, then find the day. And if someone asks you if you want to go on a trip this year, and they tell you that they want to go on the 18th, you will have basically no information until they keep going to let you know the month. But if they say they want to go on a trip in February 1st, you have a much better idea of the time of year, your general life plans for that month, if you might be able to go, etc. And then they can narrow it down with a specific date. But on the other hand, you have the argument that if you're reading something like the expiration date on milk, often it's a short shelf life, and seeing the day written first is going to be more helpful than the month. It does depend on the situation. I struggled to find a conclusion for this video because there isn't one rhyme or reason why US dates are written differently than the rest of the world. But we can land on the fact that they were almost always written and spoken that way, dating back to the founding of the country. So it does flow logically within the country that they remained that way in abbreviation rather than switching everything up to an entirely different format. I think it also brings up some great discussion points on how much one country or nation needs to conform to the majority, or who gets to actually say what is the correct way to do things. And this goes both ways and for all countries. In some areas like aviation, international standards are extremely important for the safety of everyone. Does the US date format fall in this same category? Or is it just a quirk of the US, and as long as the US uses international date standards in areas where it is necessary for safety, then it's basically just Americans doing their own thing and something for us to argue about on the internet? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks so much for watching.